Greetings all and welcome to our next talk, this time on a touchy subject that is still in the news. Quite literally, less than 5 minutes before I started composing these lines, I saw an article on a major news outlet about slavery, the United States, and the Civil War. We're about to dive into a combination of slave narratives, Uncle Tom's Cabin speeches by Lincoln, and other relevant sources. They represent a very important period of U.S. history, and the answers may not be quite as straightforward as some people on both sides of the debate wish they were. Let's get this started with a little reminder. If you cast your mind back to our talk about the Declaration of Independence, you should recall something we talked about called the dilemma of the Declaration. Well, if you've managed to forget it, it's time to put that memory to work. It's central to understanding slavery, its role in the United States, and its relation to the Civil War. Hopefully you do recall the most important phrase in the Declaration, the one that far outlasted the other now forgotten charges against the king. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as a God-given human right that no government can deny. And yet, at exactly the same time, southern state governments, and directly and by proxy, the national U.S. government, were actively denying those rights to African Americans who suffered the bonds of chattel slavery. Frankly, the U.S. couldn't have it both ways. If it was going to be a country where the words of the Declaration were taken seriously, it could not tolerate slavery. If it was going to be a slave nation, then it couldn't tolerate the ideals of the Declaration. The country would have to decide. In fact, I would argue that the U.S. couldn't be properly founded until it did. So today and over the next few weeks, we'll be looking more closely at what was really at stake and how the U.S. decided. Let's go ahead and get one major issue settled: the Bible and slavery. With the rise of the militant new atheists, Christians are often forced to consider and defend themselves against the charge that the Bible promotes slavery. As such, a bit of history is important to our apologetics at this point. I don't have time to try to tackle the entire complex question as it pertains to all of slavery over all of history, so I want to confine myself specifically to our context here. Was the Southern use of the Bible to defend slavery before the Civil War legitimate or not? We'll lay out their argument in its strongest form. The argument goes that in the Old Testament, the Bible lays out rules and laws for managing slavery. This would seem to imply that there was such a thing as quote-unquote good slavery done quote-unquote right God's way. Christ did not lead a revolt of the Roman slaves or explicitly say slavery is wrong, which pro-slavery advocates took as proof that Christ was okay with slavery. Further, we see that even people like Paul in the book of Philemon did not free the slaves even when he had the chance. There, Paul sends an escaped slave, Onesimus, who had become Paul's friend, back to his original owner, Philemon. Surely, white Southerners said, this means Paul was okay with slavery, and modern atheists use Southern defenses to say that the Bible is an evil book that is pro-slavery. Well, thankfully, if this argument seems strong to you, you'll hopefully be happy to hear that it's actually a straw man. First, we must establish what the real question is. It isn't, did Southerners use the Bible to defend slavery? Rather, it is, does a fair reading of the Bible, in its full context, defend or condemn African chattel slavery in America? Yes or no? We need to decide between the two sides. Here I must hasten to point out that the issue isn't at all one-sided like some people want you to think it is. While Christian critics are quick to point out that there were Southerners who used the Bible to defend slavery, the Bible was also the backbone of the abolitionist movement against slavery. There were also thousands of abolitionist crusaders who used the scriptures to condemn slavery. What makes one interpretation automatically viable over the other? To simply argue, however loudly, that someone said this once really gets us nowhere. Let's take a closer look at the Bible itself. It's clear that the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, does give some rules for the treatment of what English translations call slaves. Those are the passages that white Southerners, not to mention atheists, glory in, and slaveholders were quick to point them out as justification for their way of life. But wait a moment. Is the slavery in the Bible chattel slavery like it was in the United States? When you actually look closer at it, it was actually more what Americans at the time would have called indentured servanthood. The word chattel means property. A slave was someone who never became free. They were the property of their owner. A servant is someone whose labor was owned, but not their body, mind, or spirit. Southerners only got to property slavery by conveniently leaving out significant parts of the Old Testament. For example, in the Old Testament, every 50 years, all the slaves were set free in the year of Jubilee, whether those slaves were Jewish slaves or not. Jewish slaves were set free every 7 years. For some strange reason, this was never practiced by the biblical believers in slavery in the American South. There were other laws, too, that pointed to Jewish servants as people, not simply property. In the end, it shows that for white Southern slaveholders, slavery came first, and any biblical justifications happened to come sometime afterwards, usually to make themselves feel better. But stopping with the Old Testament leaves us with simply Jewish practice. What about the New Testament? We are supposed to be Christians. What does Christ have to say about it? There, Jesus tells us that some of the Old Testament law was allowed not because it was God's plan, but because the children of Israel were hard of heart. Take, for example, the ease of divorce. Christ made it clear that even though it was allowed in the Old Testament, God's ultimate plan was different. I personally think it's likely that the rules on slavery were cut from a similar cloth, and we'll see why in a minute. But what about Paul? Paul tells slaves to obey their masters, and as we said, he even sends Onesimus back to Philemon to serve him as a slave. Surely this proves that Christianity promoted slavery. Well, it does prove that Paul lived in a society that accepted a form of slavery and that he did not challenge the cultural norm directly at the time. But there are some deeper issues to consider. I would argue that Christ actually did directly address the issues of slavery, though he did not address them by name. What is the most basic requirement that Christ gives to his followers? He says that this is the essence of the law. He asks us to, quote, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. The second commandment is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these. That's Mark 12:30-31. If we are to love our neighbors as ourselves, we quickly find that slavery, in any meaningful sense of the word, becomes categorically impossible. Have you ever met a neighbor who wants to be your slave? Or do we want to be treated as equal in Christ, as brothers and sisters? Therefore, if you listen to Jesus, slavery becomes impossible for you. This is further illustrated by Christ's definition of who our neighbor is. Everyone, regardless of race or cultural barrier, as we see with the story of the Samaritan. In the book of Philemon, we see this actually illustrated. Yes, Paul does send Onesimus back, but he tells Philemon to accept him as a brother in Christ. At that moment, slavery became impossible for Philemon on a practical level. If you follow this through, the spread of genuine Christianity will inevitably lead to the destruction of slavery. And if it doesn't, then there is something wrong with your Christianity. Therefore, while we can point to some cultural accommodations and issues at various points in the Bible, the abolitionists were correct that the Bible signaled the death knell for slavery. We cannot take the words of Christ seriously and still tolerate it. So let's lay out a bit more about the role in the development of slavery as a historical institution in the U.S. Unfortunately, I found that many people have quite a few misconceptions about the South's peculiar institution, as they called it. The most common of these misconceptions is that slavery was a static entity, meaning that it never changed. People often form their ideas about slavery in the United States and the attitudes of people toward it based on what was happening in the 1850s. They then project those ideas back over the whole of American history. The truth is that slavery and opinions of it changed often. It had to evolve to become what it did in 1850. It wasn't a foregone conclusion that things would end up the way they did, nor were all Americans as morally culpable for it as some Southerners would be. Our goal here is to look at the facts, and as usual, there is a good chance that the facts may make some of us uncomfortable. On the one hand, if you grew up hearing that the South was just about ready to get rid of slavery on its own and the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery, these next few minutes probably won't be your favorites. Slavery is the essential moral evil that creates the atmosphere in which the nation could tear itself apart. On the other hand, if you've been taught the very simplistic view that the United States was an evil empire that owed all of its success to slave labor, you'll probably be equally displeased. Less than a quarter of one half of the nation owned slaves to any significant extent. Further, freedom for the slaves didn't come from outside the U.S., but rather from inside itself. The essential freedom of the slaves was laid out by the United States in its own declaration, as we talked about with the dilemma, fought for by generations of Americans, and then eventually won by the blood of hundreds of thousands of free Americans. As a historian, it's my job not to please or displease anyone, but rather to tell the truth as best I can. And the truth is that the picture of slavery is much more complex than modern myth wants to make it. Contrary to popular belief, slavery was not a normal part of the British system. In fact, in the earliest days of British colonization, the Brits prided themselves on the fact that theirs was a free society. Unfortunately, greed got the better of them. They saw the massive success of the Spanish plantation system in South America and the Caribbean, and they imported it into their own island colonies. The first slaves to arrive in what is now the United States came to Jamestown in 1619. A Dutch slaver had a few slaves left over in his hold from his stops in the Spanish colonies and, in an attempt to unload the last few, stopped by Jamestown. At this point, there was no slavery there, and these first few slaves were purchased as indentured servants, which means they actually got their freedom after a set amount of time automatically when their indenture was up. Some of these men and women survived their terms and founded farms of their own, creating the basis of a free black society in Virginia that stretches back to its earliest times. There are people alive today who can trace their lineage back to these people. Unfortunately, it wouldn't last. Over time, as more and more indentured servants became free, they became a threat to the planter elite. So the planters increasingly looked for servants who would never become free. And by the 1660s, African chattel slavery was the norm. As we mentioned, the word chattel means property. So a chattel slave is owned completely and wholly. His or her master can do whatever the master wants. Any children born to the slave become slaves as well. This was a significant departure from that older system of indentured servitude, where the master owned the servant's work, but not his or her soul. This process was gradually repeated throughout the American South, and by the 1700s, chattel slavery was tolerated and even accepted in most colonies, North and South. One major exception here was South Carolina. There, slavery didn't develop. It was the norm from day one. South Carolina was created as an overflow from the Caribbean island of Barbados. On Barbados, the British brought the Spanish system with them, and when they came to South Carolina, soon slaves actually outnumbered free people in the state, though not by much. This helps explain why, later on, South Carolina will emerge as the most radical state on the questions of slavery and secession at once. One key takeaway from here is that slavery, in general, wasn't the default setting for the British or the Americans. There was no grand plan to impose slavery on the colonies, and it wasn't part of any premeditated agenda. It just happened. People used it because it worked. The only limit to the amount of money a planter could make was the amount of tobacco he had in the ground, and the only limit to the amount of tobacco he could plant was how many hands he had out working in the field. Especially in the South, where the goal was primarily to make money by agriculture, slavery helped them do it more effectively. Therefore, they adopted it. The second phase of American slavery was brought about because of the stresses and strains of the American Revolution. It lasted from about 1776 until about 1800. As the colonies became more and more aware of their own freedoms and of the British attempts to take those freedoms away, the hypocrisy of the colonists themselves owning slaves became increasingly obvious. While, of course, there were plenty of slaveholders who could perform all kinds of moral gymnastics to try to justify why fighting for freedom and owning slaves was perfectly compatible, many others, North and South, saw the obvious contradiction with perfect clarity. Note that while slavery was legal in most colonies, it was only a major issue in the South. So, the line that the founders were all slaveholding hypocrites claiming to fight for freedom while owning slaves is a convenient oversimplification. Many of the founders owned no slaves at all, and many Americans, especially in the North, had never even seen a slave, let alone relied on slave labor to succeed in life. Still, the overall charge of hypocrisy stuck to the nation as a whole. How could the same country that wrote "all men are created equal" immediately deny that right to whole classes of people? There are a number of examples from the founders of how deeply they felt this, and some positive steps were taken towards getting rid of slavery. Patrick Henry, the man who said, "Give me liberty or give me death," once threw his hands in the air before the church altar and cried, "Who would believe that I, of all men, am owner of slaves of my own purchase?" Henry emancipated his slaves soon after. George Washington freed his slaves in his will. Thomas Jefferson, while sadly never strong enough to emancipate his, did fight the expansion of slavery and led an effort that came within one vote of ending slavery in Virginia entirely. The agreement, North and South, at this time was that slavery was a necessary evil with an emphasis on the word evil. As Jefferson himself put it, it's like, quote, having a wolf by the ears. You don't like it, but you don't dare let go. The problem was what to do about it. It sounds great that they could have waved a magic wand over the whole thing and made it go away. The hard truth was that whenever slavery was ended, it was going to cause major problems. For example, what would happen to the Southern economy when many workers suddenly disappeared? Whole families and even communities would immediately fall into poverty. And the slaves themselves, what of them? Most of them couldn't read and had very few marketable skills. They had no money, no land, no way of moving elsewhere to find work. If they were suddenly turned out of their plantations and declared free, they may find themselves free to starve. These are all real problems and that needed real solutions. What the founders decided to do was put slavery on the course of ultimate extinction. They were afraid of the economic, political, and social consequences if they tried to get rid of it immediately, so they wanted to do it slowly over time. Preferably, they wanted slavery to die a natural death, and therefore everything would slowly self-adjust. If this actually happened, it would undoubtedly be the best possible outcome. Unfortunately, the hard reality is that slavery was like cancer. Even while a tumor is smaller, the surgery to remove it will be bloody and painful. Worse, the longer you wait, the worse it will be. If you wait too long, it may well be too late. Still, it looked for a while like this slow self-abolition might just actually happen. Slavery only makes sense in certain economic circumstances, particularly in large-scale, labor-intensive agriculture where workers are needed to tend the crops almost constantly. For many years, tobacco was the major crop of slaveholding states, and it fit that bill. Unfortunately for the South, they had no idea how to practice sustainable farming. Their whole system had been based on the large amount of available land in America. A farmer would move into an area, plant tobacco until the soil was essentially dead for growing tobacco, and then move west to find more. As the U.S. began to take shape, however, places like Virginia, for example, now had a western border, and it was getting harder and harder to find new land. So, when their hand was forced, Southerners found a new crop instead. And you're probably thinking I'm going to say cotton. Actually, I'm not. That new crop was wheat. Wheat is very easy to grow. It's grass. You prepare the land, you sow the seed, you let it grow until harvest time. When growing wheat, extra workers are only needed for a short time each year. Why pay to maintain slaves all year round who are doing nothing? This shift to wheat farming made it easier for the South to move away from slavery. More and more individual planters emancipated their slaves on their own. A church in Tennessee, for example, excommunicated a member for engaging in the slave trade. The state of Georgia banned the international slave trade in 1798, years before Congress followed suit. In the North, state after state ended slavery entirely. Things seemed to be trending in the right direction. Unfortunately, even while all this good was coming along, in 1793 the unexpected happened. Eli Whitney, a tutor from Connecticut who was teaching the children of a Georgia planter, noticed the slaves on his plantation picking seeds out of short staple cotton. Short staple cotton was the kind of cotton that could be widely grown in the South. This process of picking out these seeds is very time-consuming. And so while cotton was a very profitable crop, if you have to hand process it, you just can't get enough of it to make any real money. There were some farms, like Whitney's, that grew small amounts of it if they needed to spin their own clothing. As Whitney watched the slaves working, he had an idea. He could make a machine that would do the job for them. He approached the owner of the plantation with an idea. If he created a machine that would do that job, perhaps he could use the extra time to teach those slaves to read. The bargain was struck, but it had seriously unintended consequences. Whitney created the cotton gin, but rather than benefit the slaves, it revitalized slavery in the South. The cotton gin was like industrial magic. Unprocessed cotton was fed into one end, and the seeds came out in one place and the clean cotton in another. Better, it was completely scalable and adaptable. It could be used to make gins small enough to fit on a table or large enough to need a steam engine to run. With the textile boom in Europe and the North, there was a demand for all the cotton that could be produced, and the prices were very good. What's more, cotton was exactly the sort of large-scale, labor-intensive crop that worked so well with slavery. This put the South right back to slavery's beginnings at Jamestown. The only limit to the amount of money that could be made was how many slaves there were in the field, and so if you wanted to be really rich, you needed to buy as many slaves as you could. Unbeknownst to many in the North, where cotton couldn't grow, the South began to rethink this whole slavery is evil thing. After Whitney's invention, opinion in the South began to rapidly change on slavery, leading us to our third phase, which lasts from about 1800 until the 1830s. This is really a transition period where many people are still moving forward with the idea that slavery should be dying, while many others are starting to think just the opposite. Unfortunately, even things that were intended to help end slavery backfired. We've already mentioned the cotton gin. Then, in 1807, Congress banned the international slave trade, which was supposed to be a step toward weaning the Americans off of a dependence on slavery by stopping the supply of new slaves. Well, that sounds like a great step toward getting rid of slavery, right? Instead, when the influx of fresh slaves was brought to an end, the value of the slaves already here in America skyrocketed. Slaves themselves became a significant source of wealth for many people, and in some states, like Virginia and Kentucky, where cotton couldn't grow reliably, they became slave exporting states, picking up where the international slave trade, which never completely stopped, by the way, left off. Now, freeing your slaves meant the loss of a very large investment. All this resulted in a change in Southern opinion. They went from thinking of slavery as a moral evil to thinking that slavery was just normal, neither particularly good nor particularly bad. It was just the way of the world and an accepted part of their society. Slavery had been everywhere and practiced by all different peoples, so why should now be any different? They weren't as radical as they'll become, but at the same time, this is important, they had stopped apologizing for slavery and admitting that it was wrong. They accepted it, and they believed that everyone else should acknowledge their quote-unquote right to it. In the North, none of these trends were really active, and unlike today, they had no easily available media that streamed constant news and opinion updates. Therefore, most Northerners didn't know about the shift of opinions in the South. They were actually shocked by what they saw in the Missouri Crisis of 1820. Southerners had gone from agreeing that slavery was an evil that needed to be extinguished to becoming indignant at the very suggestion that slavery could be bad. This shocked many people in the North who genuinely believed the Declaration and took it at its word. They could tolerate the contradiction as long as it was clear that slavery was dying. Now that this was no longer so clear, they began to stand up and make themselves heard. Well, as it became clear that slavery wasn't dying, a new movement rose up to demand that it end. There was a broad interest at the time throughout the United States in reform. Technology and industry were advancing rapidly, and many people were very interested in making a better world. Some of this came from the very obvious evils they saw around themselves. Some of it, though, was a broader and more philosophical movement. People began to believe that humans didn't simply have to accept evil and live with it. In fact, they began to get excited about progress and the idea that humans could get better and better and better until they actually achieved perfection, or something close to it. And not just individual people. They believed that whole cultures and societies could get better and better until they reached this perfection. Americans got this idea of human perfectionism from two major religious movements at the time, Unitarian Universalism and the Second Great Awakening. After the First Great Awakening had died down, Enlightenment deism had made steady inroads against Christianity. Remember, the Enlightenment was, in effect, the worship of humanity itself through the proxy of reason. This invariably led past deism and into actual atheism, with a huge emphasis on the idea that everything could be explained naturally through science. Religious liberalism grew up as a result. Religious liberalism was embarrassed by the traditional supernatural beliefs of Christianity. They sought to keep the trappings of Christianity and its moral imperatives, while simultaneously denying the divinity of Christ, the truth of the Bible, and the reality of anything supernatural. Some liberal quote-unquote Christians even denied the very existence of God. Imagine that, calling yourself a Christian and at the same time saying there's no God. This led one author to snarkily, but accurately, define religious liberalism as the belief that Jesus never did what he did, said what he said, or went where he went, but for some unknown reason we should follow him anyway. This grew into two distinct branches at the time. The Unitarian movement, which denied the Trinity, said that there was a single God who operated along the lines of human reason. Universalism agreed with this, but added that all paths lead to God, and therefore one day there would be universal salvation for everyone. Both of these denied the fall of Adam, and they believed that human beings were therefore inherently good, and so we could keep on getting better and better and better. The other movement was the Second Great Awakening. There had been that major religious revival in the mid to late 1700s called the Great Awakening, in which many Americans rededicated themselves to the Christian religion on a broad scale. Reacting to the incursions by the Enlightenment, the Second Great Awakening, led by Charles Finney, also exploded onto the scene about the same time. Like the First Great Awakening, it stormed through the country, sparking massive revivals nationwide. Unlike the First Great Awakening, it was much less intellectual and much more emotional. It emphasized free will and the work of the Holy Spirit in perfecting humanity. It would often resort to blatant and intentional emotional manipulation to get its point across. The key here is that it believed that God was in the process of making each of us more and more perfect by purging our sin nature. For our purposes, both movements emphasize that humans could become perfect, and both set out to try to make it happen. You didn't have to just sit back passively and accept the evil that you saw around you. You could do something about it. So Americans nationwide started a vast array of reform movements intended to correct the world's evil. This included the women's movement, prison reform, education reform, government reform, you name it. There are always many evils to see around us, and Americans in this period decided they were going to tackle them. And one of the very biggest of these movements was the abolitionist movement. An abolitionist was someone who wanted the immediate and total end of slavery, no matter what the cost and with no apologies. They wanted slavery abolished. There had been various anti-slavery movements in the nation since the colonial period, where slavery had been staunchly opposed by groups like the Quakers. This opposition had gradually transformed and popularized itself into another movement in the late 1700s and early 1800s, focused on repatriating African Americans back to Africa. This was the colonization movement, as it was called, and they believed that the difficulties posed by racism were too great to overcome, and so it was best to separate the peoples for their own good. The African nation of Liberia, with its capital of Monrovia, as in James Monroe, was founded as a result. But their success was limited and came at a high price. Liberia struggled mightily, and hundreds died in the attempt to found it, much like they had at Jamestown. More deadly to the overall effort was the fact that most African Americans had no desire to go back to Africa. Whatever their ancestry, they were born in America and wanted to remain in America. What they wanted was their human rights to be respected here in their own country. In the end, colonization was another one of those enlightened attempts to end slavery by an end run around the main problem that failed. In the early 1830s, even as white Southerners were getting louder in their celebration of slavery, the new abolitionist movement aimed to fix the issue once and for all. They didn't call for gradual emancipation or offer to send the former slaves away somewhere else. They called for the immediate and total end of slavery right now. In short, it should be completely abolished with no consideration given to the slaveholders. One of their earliest and most radical leaders was William Lloyd Garrison, who published his anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831. In his opening issue, he really set the tone for the movement. I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. On this subject, I do not wish to think or to speak or to write with moderation. No, no, tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravisher. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her baby from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse, and I will not retreat a single inch. And I will be heard. For the abolitionists, slavery was a moral evil, not a point of politics to be debated over and compromised on. It was a crime against humanity visited by specific individuals on other specific individuals. As such, they weren't interested in bandying words or coming up with highly abstract plans that would slowly phase slavery out over the course of years. It must end right now. If that meant slaveholders were impoverished in the process, so be it. They shouldn't have enslaved fellow human beings contrary to their God-given rights, the abolitionists might say. In short, they saw slavery as a sin, not just a mistake. This makes the abolitionists a whole new kind of determined. Some of them are literally willing to die for their cause. In fact, some of them do. It isn't something they want to do on the side. This is a real, obvious evil. As good men and women, they sought to combat it. Now, just to be clear, not every person who opposed slavery was an abolitionist. There were still plenty of people who disliked slavery who weren't so radical as to demand its immediate abolition. Further, most people, even in the North, didn't really care one way or the other about slavery. It was someone else's problem in a part of the country that they had never seen and never would see. That made it very easy to ignore. More on that in a little bit. So in terms of overall population, the abolitionists were a small minority of the United States. The South, however, could be forgiven for thinking that there were many more abolitionists around than they actually were. The abolitionist movement was loud, and it was insistent. It bombarded Southern post offices with piles of anti-slavery materials until the post offices just stopped delivering them and started burning them unopened, which was actually a federal crime, by the way. Anti-slavery activists peppered Congress with so many petitions to end slavery that for a time, Southerners in Congress passed what was called the gag rule, which said that any consideration of slavery would be immediately and permanently tabled. This shut down discussion on the issue. Interestingly, it was John Quincy Adams, who had become a representative in Congress after being president, who played the key role in having the gag rule overturned. To say the South didn't react well to abolitionism would be an understatement. Rather than reconsider slavery, slaveholders doubled down. They began to withdraw into what has been called a bunker mentality, meaning that they believed the rest of the country was against them and trying to destroy their precious peculiar institution and culture, as they called it. From here on, the South pushed back against the abolitionists, backing themselves further and further into the secession corner. While the majority of the North wasn't abolitionist, the abolitionists yelled loud enough for everyone. The fuse had been lit. And this conflict set up the fourth and final phase of American slavery, which lasts from about 1830 until the early 1900s. You'll notice that I have it continuing past the actual abolition of slavery. I do that because the attitudes that are involved don't simply cease with the 13th Amendment in 1865. In fact, they even enjoy a brief revival with the rise of social Darwinism. Sadly, there are a few groups out there today who still espouse this nonsense, though thankfully not nearly as many as there once were. This is the period of American slavery with which we are most familiar. It is also the one that I have the hardest time talking about in class because, frankly, I don't even like hearing some of the words they said come out of my mouth. In response to the rising tide of abolitionism, white Southerners responded viciously. They presented slavery not now as a necessary evil or even just an okay thing, but as a positive good. They said that slavery was exactly where all African Americans belonged, and that to free the slaves would be to do them a disservice. They claimed that all great societies were founded on slavery, and that it wasn't enough for slavery just to exist in the states that had already had it. Slavery must be allowed to grow. In fact, slavery should be imposed on areas where it hadn't existed before. They demanded that slavery follow the flag, and that the United States impose it on all of its western territories. Some Southerners, like David Walker, raised private armies and actually invaded other countries, intending to take them over and turn them into slave states. This process was called filibustering, which led to attacks on places like Cuba and Nicaragua. None of them succeeded for long, thankfully. Slaveholders eventually even demanded that slave state law be imposed on and inside free states. Even though only about 25% of white Southerners actually owned slaves, that 25% tended to be the ones serving in government and setting state policy. Further, with some notable exceptions, mostly in the mountainous regions, most non-slaveholding whites were willing to support the slave system. As history moved into the 1850s, no reasonable person could think that slavery was doing anything like dying. So, why is this important? Because this debate sets the stage where compromise eventually becomes impossible. As we move into the Civil War itself, the attempts to compromise break down mainly because both sides have become so radicalized on this question that there is no ground left on which to compromise at all. When that happens, political separation is seen as the only option left. And this sets up our reading of the various accounts of slavery. Frederick Douglass was a former slave and brilliant writer and orator who had escaped from the South and could not stay silent in his freedom. He used his time to campaign against slavery as a vocal proponent of abolitionism. He founded his own newspaper, the North Star, so named for, well, the North Star Polaris that slaves used while attempting to make it to free states. His autobiography is his unvarnished account of what he experienced in slavery. As you read, it's important to remember that it isn't just a story. This is Douglass's life. You'll be able to feel his anger and resentment, especially at the outright religious hypocrisy he saw in Southern Christian churches. As we noted, Christ himself laid down the plain foundations for the destruction of slavery, but Southern slaveholders had corrupted that religion and turned it into a tool of oppression for African Americans. Douglass himself remained a devout Christian and even became a licensed preacher in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. He wrote a clarification postscript to his autobiography to make sure people knew what he believed. If you feel like he's coming on a bit strong with his comments about religion, it might be useful to skip ahead and read that postscript, then pick back up where you left off. Another major account of slavery was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Stowe was a Northern woman who was outraged with the passage of the Stronger Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. This act forced even abolitionist Northerners to support slavery and return escaped slaves or face arrest and steep fines. It led directly to free African American men and women who had never been slaves at all, being hauled off into slavery by Southern slave catchers. You can probably see how that might make someone angry, and so Stowe did the most logical thing. She wrote a book. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published as a serial in various Northern newspapers, and then later collected into a formal book form. As you read it, you'll get the sense of this. It's more like a series of episodes than a long-form book. Note that while Stowe did research, the book is fiction. It's also not necessarily great fiction, being more than a tad melodramatic and cheesy at points. But the book will hit the nation like a bombshell. In fact, by the time of the Civil War, if you were caught with a copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin in the South, especially if you had more than one, like you might be trying to give them away to someone, it could mean your life. Literally, people would kill you over it. I'm not joking. The point of these books was simple. They were attempts to get the truth about slavery out to as many people as possible. As we said, it's very easy for people to ignore an evil that they don't understand and they never personally see. In free states, many people had never even seen a slave or an African American. That makes it very easy for them to think that slavery was someone else's problem and someone else's sin. What books like these did was make slavery real. And once that happened, it became impossible for people to ignore. In that sense, books like these, especially Uncle Tom's Cabin, which sold more copies than any other book at the time outside the Bible, had a massive effect on U.S. history. They made slavery a moral issue for the American people. This is important because in a political problem, there can be compromise. Should we put this road here or should we put it there? Okay, how about we put it in the middle somewhere? That works. But if the issue is moral, compromise almost instantly becomes impossible. Is a slave a human being or not? If a human, then you cannot tolerate slavery in this country and call yourself a good person. Period. And if you doubt that Harriet Beecher Stowe had that kind of effect, well, you disagree with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe during the course of the Civil War. And when they met, Lincoln didn't say, "Hello, Mrs. Stowe, how are you? It's nice to meet you." Lincoln looked down at her and said, "So you're the little woman who started the big war." And you can probably see where this is leading us. Was slavery the cause of the Civil War? Not directly, in that it was not the specific spark that ignited open conflict. The legal election of Abraham Lincoln did that. South Carolina warned that if Lincoln won, they would leave the Union. He did, and they tried. But that doesn't mean that slavery was incidental to the war either. Why did South Carolina object to Lincoln? It was because Lincoln had promised to limit slavery to the states where it already existed. It would not be allowed to expand into the territories. Southern slaveholders recognized that this was a genuine step toward ending slavery everywhere. If you dig deeply enough, you always seem to get to slavery at this period of American political history. For example, you may have heard that this was a war about states' rights. Well, what states' right exactly were they fighting to preserve? The right to own slaves and to take them into new territories. Even the Constitution of the Confederate government explicitly enshrined and protected slavery forever. I'm afraid the conclusion is unavoidable. Slavery was at the bottom of everything. It might help to think of it this way. Slavery was not the direct cause of the war, but it was the catalyst. A catalyst is something that, in a chemical reaction, makes that reaction stronger, faster, bigger, and more powerful than it otherwise would be. So, what would normally be a small explosion turns into a really big one when you add a catalyst to it. Slavery did that to American culture and politics. It made even normal, everyday problems much more explosive, and some of those problems eventually blew the country right apart. Abraham Lincoln is rightly regarded as probably the very best user of the English language for political purposes. If you want to know how to communicate with and motivate people, reading Lincoln's speeches is about as good as you can get. Lincoln hit the nail on the head with this question with his Gettysburg Address. The question in the Civil War wasn't simply about states' rights. It was the decision on the dilemma of the Declaration. Could any nation conceived on the basis that God gave all humans the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness long survive? Or would it be destroyed by one form of tyranny or another? That was the real question that the nation faced. And the dilemma was decided. The war ended and the Reconstruction Amendments, Amendments 13 to 15, settled the issue once and for all by abolishing slavery and guaranteeing African Americans their right to vote. Now I need to hasten and be clear here and say that while the issue had been settled legally and constitutionally, the fighting for true equality under the law had just begun. The South didn't surrender its opinions by default. Worse, racism seems to be a human sin and part of the human condition. It exists in some form or other in every single society on the planet. That means that while it was outlawed here, the problems that it caused didn't magically go away. In fact, the fight against discrimination and racism in all forms is a constant one that we have to refight with every subsequent generation, because in a very real way, we're fighting human sin nature itself. This would take on new forms in the civil rights movement of the 20th century. Does that mean there was no point to all of this? Certainly not. The nation had decided what it wanted to become, and it had enshrined that standard into constitutional law. Those laws would be the basis of another century and a half of reform. At this point, the nation itself had settled, legally at least, its most significant question. And that's something worth saying.